Let's take a charm pack and make this quilt. Hi, my name is Fallon and I love to quilt, and today I'm going to show you how to make this beautiful charm pack quilt in just one weekend. And yes, I mean the whole quilt. I don't mean just the quilt top. I mean we are going to piece this quilt, we are going to base the quilt the quilt, and even bind the quilt. And the best part is this pattern is so quick and easy that you'll be able to get this all done in just one weekend. So here is what you'll need to complete just the quilt top. You will need a charm pack, which is 42 5-inch squares. I'm using the Cozy Bella Solids by Moda. And then you will need 2 yards of background fabric. The rest of the materials you will need are posted up on the screen. All right, so let's start by cutting our background fabric. I'm gonna make the largest cuts first. We need 2 20.5-inch squares. I'm gonna cut a little past the 20.5-inch mark just so I can square this up nicely. So I cut there first and have a nice straight edge, and then I'm gonna turn my fabric, which is folded over, line it up on a line, and then I'm gonna cut a little past as well and keep turning to square these 2 squares up to 20.5. All right, so now that I have these 2 sides squared up, I'm gonna cut at the 20.5-inch mark now. I'm making sure it's lined up on the lines. Okay, and when I feel like it is good and even, I'm going to make the cut at the 20.5 mark. And then I have one more cut to make to get these 2 squares. And you see my ruler does not extend across here to cut on the diagonal. So I'm gonna line up 2 rulers. And now I have 4 side triangles to create the square and the square around the patchwork. All right, so I have a straight edge on my fabric here, and the next cut we are going to make is a 5-inch by width of fabric strip. Now my strip is folded over. I'm going to square up one side. The strip, you can see, is lined up on a line on my mat. And now I'm going to cut 2 5-inch squares. Set your 5-inch squares to the side. They're going to be used to make half square triangles later in the pattern. All right, so I don't want to waste this strip, and we can use it at another point in this pattern. So I'm going to trim it down to a 4-inch strip. Now trim the strip down into 4 equal parts. For me and my fabric, that is 8-inch by 4-inch segments. So set these 4 equal segments to the side. And now I have my fabric doubled up here so that I can cut 2 strips at once, and we are going to be cutting 4 4.5-inch strips. I have a straight edge here. I'm gonna line up the 4.5-inch mark on my ruler and get my straight edge here and cut. So that is 2 width of fabric strips, and then I need 2 more at the 4.5-inch mark and get my straight edge and then cut. Okay, and so now we have 4.5 by width of fabric strips, and we are going to trim these down to 39.5-inch strips. So we'll need 4 39.5-inch strips. And to cut those easily, I'm going to keep these folded and line them up, line the fold up at the 0 point on my mat. Make sure they're lined up nice and straight. And then half of 39.5 is 19.75, so 19 3/4. So I'm gonna cut these at that point on my mat to trim them up and just make quick work of that. So now I have 4 strips that are 4.5 inches by 39.5 inches. All right, and we are almost done with the cutting. So we need 4 strips that are 4 inches by width of fabric. Trim off the selvage. And those 4-inch segments from earlier that we saved, you're going to take these and sew them on to the end of each one of these strips, press it, and then we will trim it down to 47.5 inches. All right, and so now we have our 4-inch by 47.5 inch strips ready to go. All right, so before we start building the quilt top, I like to get a bit more prep work done so this quilt comes together really fast. You have your charm pack here, and there are 42 charm squares in this pack, and we are going to use every single one of them. But I think this process goes a little more smoothly if you divide out the charms now and know where you're going to be using them in the quilt. So you're going to be choosing 36 charm squares for the center patchwork area of the quilt. So choose those 36 charms for the center patchwork and then set them to the side. Then you will need 4 charms for the stitch and flip accent on the square in a square triangles. The leftover stitch and flip will also be used. You will sew these into half square triangles and then trim them up to 4 inches for the final border accent. So select those 4 charms. Once you have those 4 charms selected, you're going to mark a line corner to corner on the back of the square, then mark another line a ½ inch away. So now you have just 2 charm squares left, and these 2 charm squares will be paired with 2 5-inch background squares to make 4 half square triangles. These 4 half square triangles make up part of the beautiful border accent. To make the half square triangles, mark corner to corner on the back of both background squares. Pair a background square with a printed charm, right sides together. Sew along both sides of the drawn line. Cut between the sewn lines. Press the half square triangle and then square up all 4 of the half square triangles to 4½ inches. Set those aside. All right, so now that we have all of the prep work done, let's bring this quilt top together, and you will not believe how fast it comes together after getting all of this prep work done. Using the 36 charm squares you set aside, lay them out in a 6x6 square. So you will have 6 rows with 6 squares in each row. Once I get the layout I like to take a quick photo of it just so I can refer back to it as I sew. So I have a layout that I like, and the first thing I like to do is place a pin in the first square in each row. That just helps me keep it organized. And then I stack the rows up in order so that I can take them to the sewing machine and sew them together. So for example, this is my first square in the first row, and then I have them stacked up in order, and I can refer back to my photo for sewing these together. All right, so I have all of my rows stacked here, and as I sew each row, once I get to a block with a pin in it, I know that's the start of a new row, and I'll start over sewing a new row together. I really love sewing simple patchwork squares together. There's something just really calming about it. And I love looking at all of these colors as I sew. It's just so relaxing. So I'm gonna sew all these rows using a 1/4 inch seam. And once I get them all sewn, I'm gonna press the seams in opposite directions. I'll share a little graphic with you to show how I am going to press the seams. And once I get all of the seams pressed for each row, I can bring the rows together and create the quilt top. I'm going to pay special attention to make sure that I am pinning at the seams of each of the squares so I can get some nice points throughout there. All right, now that the patchwork square for the center of this quilt is finished, it's time to add on the corner triangles. So gather up the 4 corner triangles we cut, mark the center of the corner triangle by folding it in half, and either finger pressing it with your iron, or taking one of your marking tools and marking there. You'll want to make sure it's a marking tool that can be erased. For me, the crease is usually enough. And then match up the center of your corner triangle with the center of one side of your patchwork. You can find that by just finding the seam that is in the middle. Since this is a long edge here, I like to put a few pins in. I start at the middle and work over to one side, smoothing and making sure it's nice and even. Now we'll sew a 1/4 inch seam across here and then press the seam. All right, so we have one corner triangle added on, and we are going to add a corner triangle onto each side of the patchwork square. I like to add the opposite corner triangle on next. So I'm gonna line it up, pin and sew, and then I will add on each corner triangle and press those in the same manner. All right, so now that the corners are added on, we have a beautiful square and a square. So now we need to add those accents onto the corners of our corner triangles. And with that, we're going to need our squares that we prepped earlier for stitch and flip. Now, if you are going to use the same 4 squares, you can put these in the corners and just sew them nice and quick. Since I'm using 2 different colors, I'm going to be very careful with my placement. I'm going to have 2 of the same colors on opposite ends and then the other 2 on those other 2 ends, just to keep it a little bit uniform for me. Now, when you place the square in the corner of your corner triangle, you want to make sure it's lined up nice and even, and you have your line going along the diagonal, and then in closer to that corner is that second line we drew 1/2 inch away. Now we're going to sew directly on that line. Then flip and check and make sure it's lined up nice and even. If it is lined up nice and even, go ahead and sew along your second line there. And I do this because I don't want to sew the second line and then cut, press, and realize things are wonky. If you do that, you'll have this all just kind of hard to fix. So check it first before cutting and pressing. So you'll cut in half. You should have a 1/4 inch on either side when you cut, and then press your corners over. And then this bonus 1/2 square triangle, we're going to press and trim up to 4 inches. After adding those stitch and flip accents, you're going to lay out your first border strips, which are the 4.5 inch by 39.5 inch strips along each side of the quilt, and sew them on and press them. So I have the first border strip added on to opposite sides of this quilt top. Now, a little note here before we move on. Make sure to measure your quilt before adding the border strips. See if it measures up to a 39.5 inch square. If it doesn't, don't fret. You can just adjust the border strips. So if your square happens to be 39 inches, just trim your 4.5 inch by 39.5 inch border strips to 39 inches, and it'll all work out just fine. After you get the first border strips on, you'll want to adjust your second border strips if you had to make an adjustment before. Pay close attention to the orientation of your 1/2 square triangles on your border strip. Now, if you are interested, I did put a PDF version of this quilt together that has diagrams and everything you need to bring this quilt together, measurements, notes, everything is right here. You can download it on my website for just $2.99 if you need a visual to bring this together. So I have those strips, and I referred to the diagram to make sure I have them in the right orientation. So I'm going to put it right sides together, and I'll sew a 1/4 inch seam across here, press it. I'm going to press toward the border. Then after I get that side sewn on, I'll do the same thing to the other side, and I'll refer back to the diagram to make sure I'm adding them on in the correct orientation. After I add these border strips to the top and bottom of the quilt, I'll go ahead and do the same steps again with the final border. Now again, you'll want to measure the quilt and make sure it is measuring up to 47.5 inches. If your quilt is a little smaller, again, don't fret. Just trim up those border strips to the measurement you are getting. After getting the top completed, it's time to start basting the quilt. And I like to table baste my quilts on a fold-out table. This is a 6-foot table. I have the backing already laid out, and the backing is right side down facing the table, and the wrong side is along the batting here. So the batting is laid out as well. I have it all smoothed out, and I use some bandy clamps to keep it in place. So now what I'm going to do is finish laying out the quilt top on here. And you can see I have it folded right sides together, and it's laying in the middle of the table. And just like that, I fold it out and begin smoothing it out on the table. So here you can take the clamps and clamp the top in place as well, so that you can smooth it and not worry about moving it around as you do that. After I get it all nice and smooth, I start pinning the quilt. I have used a lot of different methods for basting quilts. I've tried a lot of different methods. This is by far my favorite. There's really no right way to baste your quilt as long as it works for you and keeps all the pieces held together really well so that you can quilt it nicely. The reason I like pin basting is because, as you can see, I'm easily able to smooth out my quilt as I work out from the center. I feel like spray basting made that kind of hard. Everything just kind of stuck together, so you couldn't really smooth out ripples or anything, and my quilting just didn't turn out as nice. Spray basting works well for you. Keep doing it. We're all gonna have a method that works better for us. So after I get all of this area on top of the table pinned to my liking, all I do is undo the bandy clamps and shift the quilt to one side, get the rest of it pinned, and then shift to the other side and get the rest of the pinned. So you can do a really large quilt this method, not have to crawl around on the floor, so it's really, really nice. After I get the quilt pinned, we'll move on to quilting it. My quilt is basted, and I used some chalk to lightly mark it corner to corner for my first stitch lines. And it's corner to corner in both directions. And then I also marked the middle of the quilt with chalk. I'm not going to stitch there, but it's going to be where I pivot with my quilting. So I have my quilting gloves on. These are Gorilla grip gloves. They work really well to help me hold the quilt and make sure it feeds through nice and even. I have my walking foot on. My top thread is this beautiful blue color, and my bottom thread is a gray that I normally use. I have my stitch length set to 1 notch below 3. It's the quilting length I really like on this machine, so I'm just gonna go ahead and get started. I'm just following the marked line I did along the diagonal of the quilt. And when I get to pins, I'm just gonna remove them. Part of the stitching when you get to the patchwork area is going to be stitch in the ditch. All right, and so I'm just gonna shift the quilt and do the same thing on the diagonal in the opposite direction. All right, so now that I have my diagonal stitch lines, I can use my quilt lock that has lines on it to keep my stitching straight without having to mark every line I want to sew. Here's what I do. I find the marked line on this quilt lock that is the distance apart I would like my stitches, so I'm going to use the third line over. I line it up with my previous stitch line, and then I line my walking foot right up next to the side of the ruler. This ruler is a 1/4 inch thick, so it's likely not going to go under my walking foot, but just be mindful of that. Be careful and make sure it's lined up against the side of your walking foot. You don't want the ruler to slide under and get hit by the needle. So just be very careful. And then I just keep my hand on the quilt lock and sew just like I would normally when I'm quilting. Remember, I marked chalk going through the center of the quilt to mark where I want to pivot and go along the other line of stitching here. What I also did to let me know I'm getting close is I put this washi tape here to let me know once my quilt lock is straight along the stitches. Once my needle gets to the washi tape on the ruler, then I know I am going to need to really look out for my chalk line because that's around where I need to pivot. All right, looks like I'm close. I might have went a tad too far. That's okay. A few stitches off and it should be fine. So I'm going to shift my quilt around. Now when I pivoted to start sewing along this other line of stitches, I kept my needle down to hold my place. Yeah, I went probably a 1/4 inch too far, really farther than I wanted to. Thankfully, this line of stitches most of the way through here is hidden in the seam and the ditch of sewing. So that little bit off is probably not going to be very noticeable once I get all of the other quilting lines done, but it is going to make it harder for me to line up my line on my ruler. So what could I do? I could pull a few of the stitches back, or I could back stitch a little. That probably wouldn't be too noticeable in the quilting, but I'm just going to go with it and just kind of eyeball the middle of that line. All right, and it honestly looks really good. I think if you're just looking at it, you're not going to notice that this side's a lot closer than the other side. So I'm just going to keep echoing through here. I'm going to keep sewing along these stitch lines. Try to be a little more careful when I get to the other end, not to sew too far, so I can space these a little more equally. All right, I'm sewing along, approaching the pivot point again. I'm going to try and slow down a little more this time and make sure I line up at my pivot point a little more carefully. Sometimes I get really excited to get a quilt finished and go faster than I should. Oh, perfect. So this one's going to be spaced much more even with all of the others. So I'm going to keep quilting like this in each segment. And then when I'm done, I'm going to trim up the quilt. So I'll cut off all of the excess batting and backing fabric. And then I will add on the binding. All right, I have my binding ready to sew onto the front of the quilt. To prep my binding, I just cut 2.5-inch strips, and then I sewed those strips end to end, pressed the seams, and then folded the binding in half with right sides out and pressed the binding really well. So I'm just going to sew the binding onto the front of the quilt, and then I will flip it to the back of the quilt and hand stitch it in place. When I get a 1/4 inch away from the edge of the quilt, I leave my needle down, turn the quilt, and sew right to the corner. I turn the quilt toward me, flip the binding up, fold it, and then fold it back down so that folded edge meets the edge of the quilt, and then I start sewing along the other side. And I do the same thing with all of the corners until I get around and can meet the binding where I started. After my binding is stitched to the front of the quilt, I flip it to the back and I glue baste it down. I have my thread started here, and all I do is go through the batting and the backing fabric come up, and then I slip my needle through the fold in the binding, go maybe between 1/8 and 1/4 inch through the fold in the binding, bring it through, and then I sink under the backing and the batting, so I make sure not to go through the front of the quilt. Just a little bit, again, between 1/8 of an inch and 1/4 of an inch. And then I just keep doing that all the way around the binding. I like to sit and watch something while I do this. It just is kind of really relaxing. And that's just how I like to finish off my binding. There's a lot of different ways that you can do this. You could stitch your binding down to the back of the quilt, flip it to the front, and top stitch it down. Whatever method you choose is fine. There's no right or wrong way to add a binding on. I had so much fun bringing this charm pack quilt together. I am so happy that I was able to find a way to use every single charm pack in the pack. I can't wait to see the quilts you make with this pattern and what charm pack you decide to use. Let me know in the comments if you plan to make this pattern, and if you do, let me know what charm pack you plan to use. Once you finish it up, I would love for you to find me on social media. I'm on Facebook and Instagram, and share some photos of your quilt with me. Thanks so much for watching, and I'll see you in the next video. Bye.